The morning sun rose over Fort Jackson, spilling gold across the wide expanse of training fields. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to uniforms and made boots stick to the dirt. Rows of soldiers stood stiffly at attention, their shadows stretching long on the ground as the bugle call echoed faintly in the distance. For most of them, the start of another day meant repetition marches, drills, inspections. For Sergeant Emily Hayes, however, each morning was a battle of its own, fought not against an enemy she could see, but against the dull ache buried deep beneath her scars. Emily stood tall among the line of recruits, her expression calm, her posture disciplined. She had long mastered the art of hiding discomfort, of burying the grimace that threatened to betray her body's protest. Her uniform was immaculate, boots polished, cap squarely on her head. To an outsider, she looked no different from the others, another soldier, molded by training, hardened by discipline. Yet behind the quiet strength of her gaze, Emily carried the weight of memories most of these young recruits could not even imagine. The rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps snapped the unit to sharper attention. Colonel James Anderson, the commanding officer, strode into view with hands clasped behind his back. A man of rigid posture and steel-gray eyes, he carried with him an aura that demanded obedience. His reputation preceded him. He was a veteran of 2 decades, known for running his men hard and mocking weakness wherever he found it. To him, soldiering was not just about following orders, but about embodying unflinching strength. He stopped at the head of the formation, letting silence build its pressure before beginning his inspection. His boots struck the ground in deliberate rhythm as he moved down the line, his eyes sharp and judgmental, scanning every detail: buttons undone, laces untied, posture too loose. Soldiers stiffened under his gaze, hoping not to catch his attention. He said little at first, only offering the occasional curt nod or sharp correction. When he reached Emily, he paused. She felt his eyes linger longer than on the others. For a brief moment, the morning sounds, the distant chirping of cicadas, the rustle of the flag in the wind, seemed to fade. The colonel's eyes narrowed. Emily's hand had brushed her side, almost instinctively, trying to ease the burn that had been gnawing at her since dawn. It was a small movement, but Anderson's gaze caught it instantly. "You look distracted, Hayes," he said, his voice flat but loud enough for the nearest recruits to hear. Emily straightened even more, her chin raised. "No, sir," she replied firmly, keeping her tone respectful. The colonel tilted his head, studying her as if searching for a crack in her composure. "Don't tell me you're already making excuses. We've only just begun the day." A ripple of unease passed through the ranks. Some recruits glanced sideways, their expressions tight with the effort of suppressing smirks. Others kept their eyes forward, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Emily's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. Inside, her ribs ached with every breath, a lingering reminder of injuries she never spoke about. She forced herself not to shift under his scrutiny. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of men like Anderson only invited more ridicule. The colonel stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the words sting sharper. "You want to be treated like a soldier, Hayes? Then stop acting like one of those who need special treatment. Fragility has no place here." The word fragility echoed in her mind, sharper than the sting of pain in her side. She had heard it before from strangers, from skeptics, even from doctors who once doubted her recovery. Each time, it cut deeper than shrapnel ever had. "Yes, sir," she said evenly, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. Anderson lingered another moment, as if daring her to flinch. Then, with a dismissive shake of his head, he moved on down the line. His boots struck the ground with renewed force, but the silence left in his wake weighed heavier than before. Emily kept her eyes fixed forward, her jaw tight. The sting of awe. His words gnawed at her, but she refused to let her face betray anything. Still, she could feel the heat of nearby stairs soldiers, curious, skeptical, even entertained by the colonel's jab. She had long grown used to whispers, but here in the open, under the burning sun and the weight of authority, the mockery cut deeper. The inspection dragged on, though Emily barely registered the colonel's critiques of the others. Her mind replayed his words again and again, each repetition pressing against the silence she fought to maintain. Fragile. Weak. Excuses. He didn't. No, he couldn't know what she had endured to stand here at all. To him, she was just another body in uniform, another recruit to be shaped or broken under pressure. When the inspection finally ended, the unit was dismissed to begin drills. Soldiers dispersed into smaller groups, some jogging toward the obstacle course, others gathering near the equipment crates. The field filled with shouts, the clang of metal, the bark of orders. Emily moved with her squad, her body taut with both discipline and restraint. She bent to lift a supply bag, the weight pulling at her side. The familiar burn flared sharper, and she clenched her teeth. No one noticed, at least. She hoped they didn't. She had made a habit of masking her pain, hiding the tremors in her hands or the stiffness in her stride. To show weakness here was to invite more scrutiny, more mockery. And she had endured enough of that for one morning. But the colonel's voice lingered in her mind, louder than the shouts around her. Fragile. The word seared itself into her chest, heavier than the pack she carried. What he and so many others didn't see was that her strength had already been tested in ways they couldn't imagine. She wasn't fragile. She was fractured, yes, scarred, broken, rebuilt, but never fragile. And though she said nothing, Emily vowed silently that the day would come when Colonel Anderson and everyone else who doubted her would learn the truth. The sun climbed higher over Fort Jackson, baking the training grounds until the air shimmered above the dirt. Sweat ran down the backs of soldiers as they hauled equipment, ran obstacle courses, and shouted cadence calls that echoed across the base. For most recruits, the grueling pace was just another day in uniform. But for Sergeant Emily Hayes, each exercise was a negotiation with her body, a body that bore the marks of battles she never bragged about, scars she kept hidden beneath her fatigues. Her squad had been ordered to move heavy crates of gear across the yard. Each box weighed close to 100 pounds, stacked awkwardly with supplies meant for field training. Soldiers grunted as they hoisted them, some working in pairs, others proving their strength by lifting alone. Emily tightened her gloves and stepped forward. She bent down, grabbed the edge of a crate, and heaved. The weight hit her like a sledgehammer. Pain flared along her ribs, sharp and hot, as if the shrapnel buried deep in her flesh had never left. Her vision flickered for a moment, but she clenched her teeth and steadied herself. No one could see her falter. She had endured worse before she reminded herself of that with every breath. Still, her body screamed for mercy. Each step was agony, each breath dragged through fire. Her legs threatened to give out, and for the briefest second, she considered dropping the crate. But she pushed forward, carrying it halfway across the yard, before the burn in her side forced her to stop. She set the box down with more force than intended, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened. The ache in her ribs radiated outward, demanding rest. She stole a glance around. Most of her squad was still moving, sweat dripping down their brows, muscles straining but steady. Emily swallowed hard. She knew what she had to do, though every part of her resisted. She approached a nearby sergeant supervising the drill. "Permission to," she began, her voice low but firm. "Permission to be reassigned to a lighter task, sir." The request barely left her lips when a voice thundered across the yard. "What's this I'm hearing?" Colonel Anderson's tone was sharp, slicing through the noise of drills like a whip crack. The soldiers froze mid-step, eyes darting toward their commander. Anderson marched forward, his expression a storm, brewing behind steel-gray eyes. He stopped just a few feet from Emily, his gaze narrowing as he looked her up and down. The corners of his mouth twitched, not with amusement, but with disdain. "A lighter task?" he repeated, his voice carrying across the yard. "Did I hear you correctly, Sergeant Hayes?" Emily stood rigid, her eyes fixed forward. "Yes, sir." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Anderson's laugh erupted loud, harsh, mocking. "Well, isn't that something? The Army's finest asking to be excused because the work's too tough." He turned slightly, making sure his words reached every ear in the vicinity. "You want to be treated like a soldier, Hayes? Then stop begging for shortcuts. This isn't a knitting club. This is the United States Army." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread among the recruits. Some smirked, others glanced nervously at Emily, unsure whether to join in or remain silent. Their commander's ridicule was law, and few dared to challenge it. Emily's chest tightened. She felt every eye on her, felt the sting of their judgment as sharply as the pain in her side. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her throat locked. The words wouldn't come. If she argued, it would sound like an excuse. If she stayed silent, she became the butt of his mockery. Anderson circled her slowly, his voice dripping with contempt. "You wear the uniform, Hayes. You salute the flag. But strength isn't about looking the part, it's about living it. And right now, all I see is fragility. Do you hear me? Fragility." The word landed like a hammer. Fragile. She hated it. It wasn't the first time she'd been branded with it, but somehow, hearing it here in front of her peers, under the scorching sun cut deeper than ever before. Her fists clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to shout, "You don't know me. You don't know what I've survived." But she said nothing. She stared ahead, her face a mask of calm discipline, though every nerve in her body burned with shame and fury. The colonel stepped closer, his breath hot in the humid air. "If you can't carry your weight, Hayes, then maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you should have stayed where it's safe at home, behind a desk." More laughter followed. This time sharper, bolder. The kind of laughter that stung worse than bullets, because it carried the weight of collective judgment. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, but she refused to flinch. Anderson smirked, satisfied with the sting his words had left. He straightened, addressing the rest of the squad. "Let this be a lesson, soldiers. The Army doesn't make room for excuses. You either do the work, or you get out of the way." With that, he barked an order for the squad to resume. The moment passed, but its echo lingered in every smirk, every whisper exchanged as the soldiers returned to their tasks. Emily bent to lift another crate, forcing her body to obey. The weight crushed down on her injured side, sending waves of fire through her ribs. She grit her teeth, sweat stinging her eyes, but she refused to stop. She wouldn't give any of them, the satisfaction of seeing her break. Each step was agony, each breath a war, but she carried the crate all the way across the yard this time. She set it down gently, almost defiantly, before straightening. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she steadied herself. She was still standing. That was victory enough for now. When the drill ended, the soldiers gathered in small groups to hydrate. The laughter had faded, but the whispers lingered. Emily felt them like daggers at her back. Some avoided her eyes. Others smirked when they thought she wasn't looking. She sat on the edge of a bench, silent, her hands resting on her knees. Her side throbbed with relentless pain, but she ignored it. She had been mocked before. She had been underestimated before. None of this was new. But somehow, Anderson's words cut deeper than all the rest. Because he wasn't just mocking her effort. he was mocking the scars that burned beneath her uniform. Scars he didn't even know existed. Emily closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. She told herself what she had always told herself since that night overseas. Endure. One more day. One more step. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange, she made a silent promise. One day she would show them. Not with excuses, not with words, but with the truth her scars carried, the truth no mockery could erase. Night in Afghanistan carried a silence unlike anywhere else. It was not the soft quiet of home, but a tense, watchful stillness that pressed against every soldier's skin. A desert air was sharp and dry, carrying with it the faint smell of dust, diesel, and sweat. Stars blanketed the sky like 1,000 watchful eyes, glimmering above the jagged outline of distant mountains. Sergeant Emily Hayes sat in the back of a convoy vehicle, her medic's bag at her feet. Her rifle rested across her lap, but her focus was on the men she traveled with. Some joked quietly to mask their nerves, while others stared into the darkness, gripping their weapons tight. Emily, as always, listened more than she spoke. She knew silence often revealed more than words. They had been on patrol for hours, navigating narrow dirt roads lined with broken walls and shadowy alleys. Every rock, every abandoned cart, every stretch of road carried the possibility of danger. For medics, the tension was doubled. Emily's job wasn't just to survive, it was to make sure others did too. Her commanding officer leaned toward her. "Keep sharp, Hayes. Intel says this stretch has been hot lately. IEDs, ambushs. Don't get too comfortable." Emily gave a curt nod. She never allowed herself comfort here. Every second was a gamble, and she had already seen enough to know how quickly peace could shatter. Minutes stretched into miles. The hum of engines was steady, broken only by the occasional crackle of radio static. Emily's hand hovered near her bag, ready at any moment to spring into action. She thought of home sometimes during these patrols, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's old radio, but the memories only came in fragments. War didn't allow her to dwell too long on anything soft. Then it happened. The explosion ripped the world apart. A deafening roar erupted beneath the lead vehicle, shaking the ground with a force that threw Emily against the steel wall of her truck. Heat, dust, and debris blasted into the night. The convoy screeched to a halt as shouts filled the air. "Contact! Contact! Man down! We need a medic!" Emily's ears rang. Her vision blurred, but instinct overrode shock. She grabbed her bag and leapt from the truck, boots hitting the dirt hard. The night was chaos now, shouts, gunfire cracking from the shadows, and the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal. She sprinted toward the wrecked vehicle, her heart hammering. A soldier lay sprawled on the ground, his leg mangled and bleeding heavily. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, pulling tourniquets and bandages from her kit. "Stay with me?" she shouted, her hands working with practiced speed. "You're not going anywhere tonight." The soldier groaned, slipping in and out of consciousness. Emily wrapped the tourniquet tight, her own hands slick with blood. Around her, gunfire intensified. Bullets sparked off the road, soldiers shouting as they returned fire into the dark. She didn't flinch. Her world had narrowed to the man before her, his life hanging on every movement of her hands. She stabilized him, called for evacuation, and moved to the next wounded man. That's when it struck. A second blast tore through the convoy, this one closer, louder, deadlier. Emily was thrown sideways, her body slamming into the ground. For a moment, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, the world was muffled, distorted as though she was underwater. Pain bloomed across her torso and legs. She tried to rise, but her body screamed in protest. She looked down and saw it. Shrapnel. Jagged, twisted metal embedded deep into her side, blood soaking through her uniform. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to move. Medics didn't stop when injured. They couldn't. Crawling, dragging her bag, she pulled herself toward another fallen soldier. Her vision swam, her arms trembling, but she pressed gauze to his wound, wrapping bandages even as her own blood spilled freely. "Hayes, you're hit," someone shouted, grabbing her shoulder. "I can still work," she snapped, voice hoarse but steady. "Help me keep pressure here." Her body begged her to collapse. Darkness tugged at the edges of her vision, but she refused to give in. The men around her needed her. She would not let them die, not if she could help it. Minutes stretched into eternity. Finally, the firefight waned as backup forces arrived, pushing back the attackers. Evac helicopters roared overhead, kicking up dirt as they descended. Emily, barely conscious, kept working until strong arms pulled her away. Medic down. Get her on the bird. She wanted to protest, wanted to keep fighting, but her body gave out. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she looked once more at the soldiers she had treated. Some would live because of her. That was enough. Her eyes closed as the helicopter blades thundered, carrying her away from the battlefield. Emily woke days later in a sterile hospital tent. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose, the steady beep of monitors her only company. She tried to move, but the pain was unbearable. Looking down, she saw bandages wrapped tight around her torso, her legs immobilized. Doctors told her later that shrapnel had torn through muscle and tissue, that she was lucky to be alive at all. But luck didn't come without a cost. The scars would never fully heal. Some pieces of metal remained too dangerous to remove. The pain would follow her always, flaring without warning, reminding her of that night. She listened quietly as the doctors explained her recovery. They spoke of limitations, of what she might never do again. She only nodded, though inside, a storm raged. She had survived hell. She had saved lives while bleeding out herself. She would not let scars visible or invisible define her as weak. When she finally returned home months later, she carried those scars beneath her uniform. She never spoke much of what happened. To most, she was just another soldier who had served and returned. But every time she dressed for duty, every time she laced her boots, she remembered the sand, the fire, the screams. And she remembered the promise she made to herself in that dark night of chaos. Never break, never quit, never let them see weakness. And so, when Colonel Anderson mocked her on the drill grounds, calling her fragile, Emily said nothing. He couldn't see the truth carved into her skin. He couldn't hear the echoes of war that still rang in her ears. But one day, he would. Because scars, no matter how well hidden, always had a way of speaking louder than words. The days at Fort Jackson blurred together in rhythm morning reveille, endless drills, sweat-soaked afternoons, and nights too short to heal tired muscles. For Sergeant Emily Hayes, each day was another silent negotiation with her body. Her comrades saw only the surface, a soldier who moved with determination, who rarely complained, who pushed through drills with an iron will. What they didn't see was the storm beneath her uniform, the scars that burned, and the muscles that ached with every step. Silence had become her armor. When she rose at dawn, long before others stirred, she wrapped her ribs tightly beneath her fatigues, the fabric pressing against old wounds like a second skin. It wasn't regulation, but it kept the pain contained. She jogged the track with the others, each breath stabbing her lungs, but her face revealed nothing. On the obstacle course, she climbed ropes and scaled walls, her body screaming in protest. She landed heavy on her knees sometimes, biting down so hard on her tongue to hide the groan that blood filled her mouth. And no one noticed. At first, she thought that was good. The fewer people who knew, the fewer who would ask questions she didn't want to answer. But as the weeks dragged on, the whispers began to grow. She's strong, but different, some said. She doesn't talk much, keeps to herself. Others were less forgiving. Fragile. You saw how the colonel called her out. She hides it, but she's not cut for this. Emily heard the whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. She caught the sideways glances during drills, the smirks when she slowed a fraction of a second. The judgment passed in silence. Still, she said nothing. She had endured worse than whispers. She had endured blood and fire, the agony of shrapnel in her flesh. She could endure this too. But silence was heavy. One evening, after a long day of field exercises, Emily sat alone at the far end of the barracks, unlacing her boots. The others clustered together in groups, laughing, trading stories, tossing playing cards on bunks. She watched from a distance, a quiet observer. Her hand brushed her side unconsciously, the ache sharp after a day of strain. Private Martinez, a young recruit with a wide grin and too much energy, noticed her and strolled over. "Hey, Sarge," he said, dropping onto the bench beside her. "You don't talk much, do you?" Emily smirked faintly. "Guess I save my voice for when it matters." Martinez shrugged. "Fair enough. Just saying, you don't gotta carry it all alone, you know. People here, they respect you more than you think." Emily glanced at him, studying his earnest expression. She almost laughed. Respect? She had seen the smirks, heard the whispers, but she didn't correct him. She only gave a small nod. "Thanks." The moment passed, and Martinez drifted back to his group. Emily unlaced her boots slowly, her thoughts tangled. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that her silence wasn't misread as weakness. But doubt gnawed at her. The next morning, drills began again. Colonel Anderson loomed nearby, his sharp eyes scanning the field. He didn't need to say much anymore. His earlier words had left their mark. Whenever Emily faltered, even slightly, when she adjusted her side mid-run, when she paused to catch a breath, the colonel's smirk said enough. But Emily kept going. She carried packs that felt heavier each day. She ran until her legs burned. She scaled walls, crawled under barbed wire, waded through mud. The pain in her side never left. It was a companion she couldn't shake. Yet she refused to collapse. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. There were nights she lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the barracks dark and quiet around her. Her ribs throbbed, the scars pulling at her skin, and she wondered if silence was bravery or cowardice. She wondered if speaking up, showing them the truth, would bring relief or only more judgment. But the memory of that night overseas always answered her doubts. The explosion, the blood, the screaming. She had survived that without asking for pity. She had saved lives while bleeding out herself. She had earned the right to remain silent if she chose. Still, silence weighed heavier with each passing day. One afternoon, during weapons drills, Emily's hands trembled as she reloaded. The recoil of the rifle jarred her ribs painfully, but she kept firing, her shots hitting target after target. When the session ended, one of her squad mates, Private Jackson, muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Not bad for someone who nearly asked to be excused from carrying crates. The words stung more than she expected. She wanted to snap back, to tell him where she'd been, what she'd endured. She wanted to roll up her shirt, show him the scars carved across her skin. But she swallowed the retort and walked away. Later that night, in the mess hall, the whispers grew again. Jackson retold the story of the colonel mocking her, exaggerating for laughs. Some soldiers chuckled. Others shook their heads, but no one stopped him. Emily sat at a table by herself, staring at her untouched tray. She clenched her fists beneath the table, nails biting into her palms. The anger boiled, but still she said nothing. Her silence was both her shield and her prison. The colonel noticed, of course. He always noticed. His glances grew sharper, his tone colder whenever he addressed her. He saw her endurance, but he misread it as stubborn pride rather than quiet survival. To him, she was just another soldier who refused to admit her weakness. But deep down, Emily knew it couldn't last. The whispers, the mockery, the weight of silence, it was all building toward something. She didn't know when or how, but she knew there would come a moment when her scars would no longer stay hidden. For now, though, she endured. She endured the pain. She endured the whispers. She endured the colonel's cold judgment. And every time she tightened her boots, every time she strapped on her pack, every time she forced her body through another day of relentless drills, she whispered the same words to herself. Not fragile, not broken, still here. The world might not hear it yet. The colonel might not see it yet. But the time was coming when her silence would break and her scars would speak for her. The September heat in South Carolina was merciless. The kind of heat that clung to skin like wet cloth, that turned every breath into a struggle and made sweat pour in relentless streams. By midday, the training field at Fort Jackson shimmered in waves of dust and exhaustion. The platoon had already spent hours running obstacle courses, scaling walls, and dragging heavy dummies across the field in simulated casualty drills. Muscles burned, lungs screamed, and yet the orders kept coming. Sergeant Emily Hayes moved among them, every step measured. She carried a training dummy on her shoulders, its dead weight pressing against her already fragile ribs. Each stride was agony. The straps of her vest cut into her collarbones. Sweat soaked her fatigues, and the old shrapnel scars beneath her uniform burned with each jolt of movement. She told herself what she always told herself. One more step. One more breath. Keep moving. But the pain was relentless, gnawing at her resolve like a wolf at bone. She adjusted the dummy's weight, biting down hard to keep from grimacing. Around her, soldiers grunted with effort, their voices blending into the hot, heavy air. And then came the colonel's voice. Hayes! It cracked like a whip across the yard. Emily froze for a heartbeat, shifting the dummy's weight again before turning toward him. Colonel James Anderson stood near the sidelines, arms crossed, eyes sharp with scrutiny. You call that carrying? He barked. You're dragging it like a sack of laundry. Put some backbone into it. A few recruits smirked, their exhaustion momentarily lifted by the colonel's barb. Emily clenched her jaw and kept walking, adjusting her posture, refusing to let him see her stumble. But Anderson wasn't finished. His boots crunched across the dirt as he strode closer. Look at you, barely holding it together. Tell me something. Sergeant, are you a soldier or a charity case we're all carrying? The words cut deep. They weren't just aimed at her. They echoed through the platoon, branding her in front of everyone. Emily's arms trembled beneath the dummy's weight. Pain stabbed at her ribs like hot knives. She wanted to shout back, to tell him that she had carried men heavier than this dummy, while bleeding out in the dust of Afghanistan. She wanted to show him the scars that still burned beneath her uniform. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of silence and discipline. Pick up the pace. Anderson barked again. Or do you want us to excuse you like last time? Maybe hand you a desk job with the clerks so you don't hurt yourself? The laughter that followed was harsher this time, sharper, carrying the sting of humiliation. Emily's vision blurred, whether from sweat or fury she didn't know. Her legs wobbled, and for a moment she thought she might actually collapse. The pain in her side surged, tearing through her resolve. She dropped to one knee, the dummy slipping slightly off her shoulder. Gasps and chuckles rippled through the ranks. Anderson seized the moment. "There it is," he said, his voice dripping with triumph. The mighty Sergeant Hayes, brought down by a little weight. "You can't even stand? Pathetic. What are you doing here if you can't keep up with the rest of them?" The words struck harder than any blow. Emily forced herself back to her feet, dragging air into her lungs. Her body screamed at her to stop, but something inside her, anger, pride, survival, pushed harder. She straightened, gripping the dummy tighter, her chest heaving. For the first time in weeks, she spoke back. "I'm still standing, sir." The colonel raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk curling at his lips. "For how long?" The soldiers around them froze, caught between pity and curiosity. Some waited for her to crumble, others for the colonel's next cutting remark. But Emily's voice grew steadier, louder, carrying across the yard. "You think I'm weak because you see me falter. But you don't know the half of it. You don't know what I've carried before." Anderson's smirk faltered. "Careful, Sergeant." Emily set the dummy down gently on the ground, her hands trembling not from weakness now, but from the surge of adrenaline coursing through her. She straightened to her full height, her eyes blazing. "Careful?" she repeated, her voice shaking with restrained fury. "You think I'm making excuses? You think I'm fragile? You don't know a damn thing about me." The platoon was silent now, every soldier riveted. Anderson took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Watch your tone, Hayes. You're out of line." Emily's hands shook at her sides, her breath ragged, but she refused to look away. The years of silence, the weight of scars hidden beneath her uniform, the whispers and the laughter, they all boiled to the surface. She had held it in too long. Her voice rose, cutting through the still air. "You want to know why I asked for a lighter task that day? You want to know why sometimes I falter? It's not weakness. It's because there's shrapnel buried in my ribs from when a bomb tore through my convoy. It's because I kept patching up wounded men while I was bleeding out myself. It's because I didn't quit when everyone thought I should have died." Gasps rippled through the platoon. Soldiers exchanged stunned glances, the smirks vanishing from their faces. Anderson froze, his jaw tightening. Emily's voice dropped, steadier now, each word weighted with years of pain. "So when you call me fragile, when you laugh at me in front of them, you're not mocking weakness. You're mocking survival." The silence that followed was suffocating. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the colonel and Emily. For once, no one dared to laugh. Anderson's mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed at a loss. His eyes flickered not with mockery now, but with something else. Recognition, maybe. Or shame. Emily's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, hadn't planned to let her scars speak. But now that the words were out, she felt a strange sense of relief. The silence she had carried for so long had finally cracked. The dummy still lay on the ground at her feet, but Emily no longer felt its weight. She stood taller, straighter, her gaze locked on Anderson's. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't broken. She was still here. And for the first time, the platoon began to see her not as the woman mocked by the colonel, not as the soldier whispered about behind her back, but as someone who had endured battles far beyond the training field. The breaking point had come, and in breaking, she had finally shown them her strength. The training field had never been so quiet. Even the hum of cicadas in the nearby trees seemed to pause, as if the entire world held its breath. Dust hung in the late afternoon air, swirling in faint golden shafts of light. Every soldier stood still, eyes locked on the confrontation unfolding at the center. Sergeant Emily Hayes stood tall despite her trembling muscles, her chest rising and falling as if she had just fought a battle, and in a way, she had. Her words still echoed across the yard. "You're not mocking weakness. You're mocking survival." For once, Colonel James Anderson said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard, but there was no quip, no cutting remark. The silence stretched. Soldiers shifted uneasily, waiting for his response. Emily could feel the eyes on her, dozens of them, burning with shock, with curiosity, with something else she couldn't yet name. She had never wanted this attention. For years she had kept her scars hidden, believing they were her burden alone. But now the truth was out. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could walk away now, leave it at words. But something deep inside her, something raw and unyielding, told her this was not the moment to retreat back into silence. Words could be doubted, twisted, forgotten. But the truth written on her skin could not. Her voice, steady but low, cut through the stillness. "You don't believe me? You want proof? Fine." And before anyone could stop her, she hooked her thumbs beneath her damp fatigues and began to unbutton her jacket. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers looked away instinctively, unsure what she was doing, but most couldn't tear their eyes from her. Anderson's brows furrowed in surprise, a flicker of alarm flashing across his face. Emily shrugged the jacket off her shoulders. Beneath it, her tan undershirt clung to her frame, darkened with sweat. With deliberate slowness, she tugged the fabric upward, baring the skin of her torso. The sight silenced every last whisper. Her abdomen and ribs were a canvas of jagged lines and puckered flesh. Long, pale scars crossed her side where shrapnel had torn through muscle and skin. Some wounds had healed into thick ridges, others into sunken valleys. The pattern was brutal, chaotic, and unmistakable. This was not the mark of clumsiness or accident. This was war carved into flesh. Several soldiers audibly gasped. Private Jackson, who had mocked her weeks before, dropped his gaze, shame flooding his features. Martinez's eyes widened, his grin gone, replaced by raw respect. Even the toughest of the platoon shifted uncomfortably, their bravado crumbling. Emily's voice was quiet now, but it carried weight. "This is what I live with every single day. These scars aren't excuses. They're reminders of what I've survived, of the men I couldn't save, of the fact that I'm still here, even when I shouldn't be." Her hand brushed across one of the jagged lines, her fingers tracing the memory of pain. "Every time I run, every time I lift, every time I breathe too hard, these scars burn. And still, I show up. Still, I carry what you ask me to carry. Still, I stand." The silence that followed was heavier than before, but different now. It wasn't the silence of disbelief or mockery. It was the silence of realization. Anderson stared at her, his face unreadable. For years, he had seen scars on men, combat wounds worn proudly, displayed as badges of honor. But to see them on her, the soldier he had dismissed so quickly, the one he had mocked, something shifted behind his eyes. He had underestimated her, not because she was weak, but because he had refused to look past his own assumptions. Emily let her shirt fall back into place, the scars disappearing beneath the fabric. But the image lingered in every mind present. Her eyes swept across the platoon. "So if any of you still think I'm fragile, go ahead. Laugh, mock, call me weak. But know this, I've carried more pain than most of you will ever know. And I'm still carrying it. That's not weakness. That's strength." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. No one moved. No one laughed. At last, Colonel Anderson spoke, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its sharp edge. "Sergeant Hayes." Emily snapped her head toward him, expecting another cutting remark. But instead, she saw something she never thought she would from him: hesitation. His eyes, so often cold and calculating, now held something closer to respect. "You should have said something sooner," he muttered. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it wasn't mockery either. Emily's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, I shouldn't have had to." The words struck harder than any salute. Anderson's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the truth in her words, before turning sharply toward the rest of the platoon. "Back in formation," he barked, though his tone lacked its usual bite. The soldiers scrambled back into line, their faces still marked with shock. But as Emily moved to join them, something shifted. Shoulders that had once turned away now straightened beside hers. Eyes that had once narrowed in judgment now glanced at her with quiet respect. The whispers that had followed her for weeks had been silenced, not by excuses, but by scars. As the drill continued, Emily felt the weight on her chest lighten, not the scars, not the pain, but the burden of silence. For years, she had carried her story alone. Now it was no longer hidden. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, one truth was clear. Her scars had spoken louder than words ever could. The sun had dipped lower over Fort Jackson, staining the training field in hues of amber and gold. The cicadas had resumed their hum, but the platoon was not the same as it had been that morning. Something had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. When Sergeant Emily Hayes pulled her shirt back down and retook her place in formation, the silence that followed wasn't the same suffocating quiet she had endured for weeks. This silence was heavier, yes, but laced with a new current: respect, guilt, even awe. The soldiers around her stood straighter, their eyes forward, but their stolen glances toward her carried none of the mockery of before. Colonel Anderson paced slowly before the line. His boots crunched against the gravel, his face tight with an expression none of them could easily read. For once, his words didn't fly sharp or cruel. He studied the platoon, then his gaze settled on Emily, lingering longer than usual. "Training is done for the day," he said abruptly, his voice clipped. "Fall out." The command was simple, but it carried none of the usual finality. Soldiers broke formation slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure what to do next. Normally, they would chatter, joke, complain. Now they dispersed in near silence, some lingering with furtive glances at Emily. Emily herself bent to retrieve her jacket from the dirt, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she ignored them. She slipped into the jacket, buttoning it briskly, then turned to leave. But before she could, Private Jackson stepped into her path. His usual swagger was gone. His eyes were downcast. He opened his mouth, faltered, then tried again. "Sergeant." Emily raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I didn't know," Jackson muttered, shame heavy in his tone. "I shouldn't have, those things I said." "You were ignorant," Emily interrupted, her voice even but not unkind. "Now you know better." Jackson swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, Sergeant." He stepped aside, and she passed without another word. Others followed suit. Martinez clapped her gently on the shoulder as she walked by, his grin softer this time, not playful but proud. "Respect, Sarge," he said simply. Each acknowledgement was brief, understated, but they formed a chorus louder than any insult she had endured. The whispers that had once shadowed her had vanished, replaced by a quiet, growing admiration. That night in the barracks, Emily sat on her bunk, her ribs wrapped tightly as always. She expected the usual isolation, the quiet distance she had grown used to. But instead, soldiers gathered near her, not with invasive questions, but with quiet solidarity. Jackson lingered nearby, still subdued. Martinez shared his rations. Even the toughest among them, those who had once smirked at her struggles, now nodded respectfully as they passed. Emily said little, but she felt the shift like a weight lifting. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't carrying her silence alone. The next morning, drills resumed as usual. The sun was merciless, the packs heavy, the courses unforgiving. But something was different. When Emily shouldered her load, Martinez fell in step beside her without being asked. Jackson pushed himself harder, as if to prove something not to the colonel, but to her. The platoon moved more like a unit, less like individuals. Anderson watched. From the sidelines, his sharp eyes caught every change. He saw how the platoon's glances toward Hayes were different now, how they mirrored her pace instead of mocking it. He saw how she pushed through pain with quiet resolve, never asking for leniency, never breaking, despite the scars she had revealed. He saw, too, how his own words from days past now hung over them like ghosts' mockery that seemed small in the face of what she had endured. That evening, as the platoon gathered in the mess hall, Anderson made an uncharacteristic appearance. His presence hushed the room instantly. Soldiers straightened, trays forgotten, eyes darting nervously. The colonel rarely ate with them. His presence was always reserved for commands, inspections, discipline. But tonight, he walked straight to Emily's table. She looked up slowly, her fork paused mid-her. Her expression was calm, but inside, her chest tightened. "Sergeant Hayes," Anderson said, his tone still crisp, but stripped of its mocking edge. "Sir?" she replied, setting her fork down and standing. Anderson studied her for a moment. The room was silent, every soldier straining to catch the exchange. "I misjudged you?" he said at last, his words blunt but heavy with weight. "What you revealed yesterday, it changes things. Not just for you, but for this platoon." Emily held his gaze. "With respect, sir, it shouldn't take scars for you to see a soldier's worth." A murmur rippled through the mess hall. Anderson stiffened, then nodded once. "You're right, and I'll remember that." For a long moment, the two held each other's eyes, commander and soldier, once adversaries, now bound by something unspoken. Then Anderson turned sharply, on his heel and left, his boots echoing against the hall's linoleum floor. The silence broke into a low buzz of conversation. Soldiers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers of astonishment. Never before had they heard the colonel admit to a mistake. Emily sat slowly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline racing through her veins. She hadn't needed his apology, but hearing his acknowledgement felt like a wound salved, a burden lifted. Respect had been earned, not begged, not demanded, but proven. In the days that followed, the change became undeniable. Drills remained brutal, the heat unforgiving, the work relentless. But the platoon's dynamics shifted. They moved together, watched out for one another. And at the center of it, quietly, was Emily. Her scars had once been a source of isolation. Now, they were a symbol of endurance, of survival, of strength in silence. Soldiers who had once mocked her now matched her pace. Even Anderson's orders carried a different tone, not softened, but sharpened by respect. One evening, after a particularly grueling run, Martinez jogged beside her, panting. "Sarge," he said between breaths, "you ever think maybe you're the reason we're running harder these days? Like, you lit a fire under everyone." Emily smirked faintly, shaking her head. "I think the colonel's still the reason we run harder." "Maybe," Martinez said with a grin. "But you're the reason we don't quit." Emily didn't respond, but his words settled deep. That night, as she lay on her bunk, the barracks buzzing with quiet chatter, she realized something. For years, she had carried her scars alone, fearing they marked her as weak. Now, they had become her strength, not just for her, but for those around her. And as she drifted into sleep, her ribs aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in years, she knew this truth. Respect wasn't demanded or given freely. It was earned. And she had earned it not by hiding her scars, but by showing them. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the platoon had experienced before. Training was still merciless long runs beneath the sweltering Carolina sun, obstacle courses designed to push bodies past braking, drills that left even the strongest recruits doubled over in exhaustion. Colonel Anderson hadn't gone soft. If anything, his expectations grew sharper. But there was something different now, something that changed the air in every formation, every drill, every shared march across the dusty fields. Respect. Where once Emily Hayes had been the subject of whispers, now she was a quiet center of gravity for the unit. Soldiers matched her pace, not out of pity, but out of solidarity. They had seen her scars, heard her truth, and realized that toughness wasn't measured in loud voices or unbroken bodies. It was measured in the will to keep standing, no matter what the past had carved into you. Colonel Anderson, too, had shifted. He didn't announce it, didn't soften his voice, or turn training into comfort. But his jabs and mockery had vanished, replaced by commands that were sharp but stripped of derision. He watched Hayes more closely now, not to catch her stumble, but to see how far she could push herself, and how far she pulled the platoon with her. It was Martinez who noticed first. "Funny, isn't it?" he said one night in the barracks, flopping onto his bunk. "The colonel hasn't called you fragile and weak, Sarge. Not once." Emily smirked faintly as she unlaced her boots. Maybe he's running out of material, but she knew the truth. Anderson had learned something from her scars, something he couldn't admit outright, but showed in every small change. The turning point came during a field exercise late one Friday. The platoon had been ordered to simulate a rescue under fire, dragging wounded dummies across rough terrain while under the burden of full packs and rifles. It was grueling, the kind of exercise that tested not just strength, but grit. Private Jackson, once her harshest critic, struggled with his dummy halfway through the course. His face flushed, arms trembling, legs buckling. A month ago, Emily would have expected laughter, jeers, the same cruel whispers she had endured. But this time, something different happened. Without hesitation, 2 soldiers sprinted to his side, grabbing the dummy's arms and lifting some of the weight. "We finished together," Martinez barked, his grin replaced by determination. Emily jogged nearby, her ribs aching with each stride, and felt a swell of something she hadn't in years. Pride. They were learning, not just to fight, but to fight for each other. When the last soldier crossed the finish, Anderson stood waiting. His eyes scanned the unit, then lingered on Hayes. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and she caught the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Not approval, not pity, respect. That evening, Anderson called the platoon together. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and violet. Soldiers stood in rows, sweat still drying on their uniforms, dust clinging to their boots. Anderson's voice carried across the field, steady and deliberate. "You've improved," he began, his eyes sweeping across them. "Not because the course got easier, but because you learned what it means to carry more than your own weight." He paused, then glanced toward Emily. "Some scars are visible. Some are not. But every soldier carries something. And from this day forward, under my command, no one will mock what they can't see. Not weakness. Not pain. Not survival." The words hung heavy in the evening air. Soldiers exchanged looks of surprise. Anderson rarely gave speeches, and never like this. Emily stood in silence, her heart thudding. She hadn't asked for his words, but hearing them, hearing him say aloud what she had fought so long to prove, felt like a closure she hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw not just the hardened colonel who had once mocked her, but the leader he could be when stripped of prejudice. In the days that followed, the platoon carried his words into their work. Training still broke them down, But now they built each other back up. Emily no longer ran alone in silence. Martinez and others matched her pace. Jackson, humbled, pushed himself harder and never spoke an unkind word again. Even in moments of exhaustion, when knees buckled and lungs burned, no one laughed at another's falter. Instead, they lifted, they carried, they endured together. Emily's scars had changed not only how they saw her, but how they saw themselves. On her last night at Fort Jackson before deployment orders came in, Emily sat outside the barracks beneath a sky scattered with stars. The air was cooler, the cicadas quieter. She rested her hands against her ribs, feeling the familiar ache, but this time the pain carried no shame. Anderson approached quietly. She heard the crunch of his boots on gravel before she saw him. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, his tone formal but not cold. "Colonel," she replied, standing. He studied her for a long moment, the moonlight etching lines into his face. "You've taught me something," he admitted at last. The words came stiffly, as though dragged from a man unaccustomed to confession. "Scars don't make a soldier weak. They remind us who has already survived the fight." Emily held his gaze, her voice calm. "I didn't set out to teach anyone, sir. I just wanted to be seen for what I am." "You are," Anderson said simply. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned and walked back toward the barracks. Emily watched him go, the weight of his words settling deep. It wasn't a full apology, but it didn't need to be. The respect was real, and that was enough. When deployment orders came, the platoon marched out with heads high and steps in unison. They carried their rifles, their packs, and the invisible burdens each soldier bore. But now they carried them differently. Together, Emily marched among them, her scars hidden once more beneath her uniform, but no longer a secret. They were not marks of weakness, not excuses, but a testament to survival, to endurance, to the strength of standing again and again. The colonel's voice rang out at the front, commanding and firm, but it carried something new now. A reminder, woven into every order, respect. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one truth was clear: Emily Hayes's scars had become more than her story. They had become the platoon's lesson, Anderson's change, and a legacy that would outlive the dust of Fort Jackson. A legacy of scars.